just want to mention before we go on, a couple people have had the same issue, and it's not something that actually had ever come up before. So I've got some tips and tricks I've started to add here, as you note, right? A collection of different tips and tricks for quick reference, right? Just under content categories, you'll find tips and tricks there. So the first one I do want to take a minute and talk about because a couple people have had the same kind of an issue, and I fully understand now exactly why, right? So I also have the code itself, so you can copy and paste it more easily out of this text file because this is just an image down here, right? But anyway, the idea is this, right? Normally, every time there's a view model error, right, which can come from our data annotations or I-validatable object, things like that, uh, we always get told, right, that the information appears in those little spans on the screen, right, so we can see exactly what the errors are, okay? But sometimes it might appear that, hey, look, there seems to be a validation error, and we know that, as I say here, because if we set a breakpoint on the if where you do your test for validation, if it fails, then we know how an if structure works. You don't go into the code inside the if branch, right, if it fails the test. So it skips over that, returns to the screen, but there's no information. There's nothing to say what went wrong, right? It clearly wasn't a database error because you didn't even get to the point of trying to save it to the database, right? It's failed on that if where you test for validation. So if there's no feedback on the screen, how do we get to the bottom of the issue? What is going on here, right? So I just want to mention, first of all, thanks to Devin for first bringing up this issue, and he sent me a bit of code. Now I've modified the code he gave me slightly because I like to see these messages right on the view. So we're going to go through an example of this situation exactly. Let me just finish talking about this though. So basically what you want to do is that if, right? We have two different ones that we often put in our code where we actually check the model state, right? If it's valid. It might be a simple if like this, model state is valid, that'll be true or false. If there are any errors, validation errors, then it'll be false. We accomplish the same thing with our if, where we do our try update model. Okay, it returns true or false. If there's any validation errors, then it gets false, right? So look for, the curly brace that ends the if branch, and usually we don't have anything after it. So what the suggestion is to put an else, right? So, okay, let's go in and have a closer look here. So we'll talk about this code, but I might as well, it's up on the screen, I might as well just quickly discuss it. Notice I say here, not for production code, right? You wouldn't leave this in place once you've actually deployed the application. But, if while you're developing this unusual behavior seems to be happening, this can help us get to the bottom of exactly what's going. And then we can fix the problem, right? And then remove this code or at least comment it out, right? So that it doesn't have any more effect, okay? So what we're doing here is we're going into the model state, right? And we're checking all, model state is basically a collection of key value pairs. Now the value is often a collection of things, right? And the value, okay, will have its own errors collection. And if there are any errors in the value of the key value pair, which we call model state, right, then we know there was a validation error. So this first line of code, what is, pardon my sense of humor, these are all the boo-boos, right? These are all the model state key value pairs where there's an error, right? And that just gives us all our collection of boo-boos. So I'm going to do it for each loop, going through each boo-boo there was, right? And we'll grab the key, first of all, because it is a key value pair, right? And there's only one key in the key value pair. But then we're going to go into the actual errors collection of the value, right? And so that gives us all the errors that there are, okay? And then for each one, we can pull out the error message, and then we can add something into the model state. Now remember how model state errors work. The first parameter we pass, I just have an empty string. I could have used string.empty or just a pair of empty quotes, does the same job. That means it will appear at the top of the page, right? In that validation summary span that we always have at the top of the page itself. So that's where this message would appear. And I'm just going to say for a given key, here's our error message, right? So anything, even if it doesn't have somewhere else on the page to show its message, it'll give us a spot to then see it. So that's the whole idea. Now, just to kind of walk through putting this code into practice, I have, with permission, a copy of the catering management application here a student was working on and asked for help, right? So basically, they did get as far. They didn't finish the create process, but in the edit process, they added all the code for the many-to-many for adding the rooms and everything else. But the problem they were having is they were getting exactly that behavior. It seemed like there was a validation error, but they weren't getting information on it. So I'm going to do here, I'll set a breakpoint right here on the if, right, where we check validation with our try update model. Okay, so let me actually run the application and we'll just check how we determine this is the issue to investigate, and then we'll see how this code can help fix it for us. Pardon me. All righty. Building the database, populating all the data, and so on. Okay, so let's come to functions, and I'll just pick edit for any function I want here, right? I'll come down here. I don't even actually need to do an edit, but I'm going to do something. I'll add in an additional room, right? I could now. Thing is, if I take out something like this that's required, and I click submit or save, well, it actually doesn't send the data to the controller, right? Anything that can be checked locally is going to be checked locally. So, I'll put that back. I think it was 1,000 or something like that, right? Okay. But this doesn't get checked locally, okay? And I'll just submit here. So now we're at our if, right? So I'm going to use my up at the top here, the step over, okay, debug little button here. So that'll step over the if, and look at that. We've jumped right down. We passed everything inside the if itself, right? We skipped it all because it failed. It failed the validation check, okay? Now, if I just click continue, because, okay, there's nothing else, this is just going to get all the data ready to redisplay on the screen. Sure enough, we're back again. But, okay, why, right? Why are we here? What is the problem? We're getting no information whatsoever about it, right? Oh, I just find it easier to copy paste when I'm not running. So I'm going to stop running for now. And I've got my little copy paste file, the same one that we were talking about. So I'm going to just grab that else branch for the if. So I'll come down here. So here's the if, right? Here's the end of the curly brace for the if itself. So I'll just put this else branch in, right? And what we can do is just for educational purposes, I'll set a breakpoint in here somewhere and we'll just run again. Okay, so I even tried the same one. Okay, now of course my changes weren't saved, so I'll pick a different room here and we'll click save. Okay, so yeah, we are at our test for validation on updating all of these specific properties, our whitelist here. Okay, we've jumped to the else branch, so I can come down in here, grab all my boo-boos, right? And then for each boo-boo in my collection of boo-boos, okay, I'll come down here. Now I can hover over and I can see boo-boo, right? So what do I see? I see the key is function rooms, okay, room capacity, right? Error count is 1, okay? And as I go further on, we see here that's the key then is that whole big long name, okay? I'm going to go through all the errors. Now, let me just talk about that. I have a for each loop here. In my experience, you're never going to get more than one error, but it is set up to hold a collection. I could have gotten away because I'm pretty confident about that it's only the first error. If there was more than one, I'm concerned. I could have just done a first or default, okay, link expression instead of having an actual for each loop. But it's not going to hurt, right? I'm covering all the bases here. We'll loop through every error just in case there is more than one, because for each one we'll add the error message. It's the same key, but we would add the error message, and then we get more and more model errors being added, right? Okay, so I just want to stop and kind of look at what's going on in the code here itself. We have the key, and as I go on, right, then we can access the error message itself, and that's the message. Capacity must be greater than 0, right? Okay, so I'll just click the continue button, and that should bring us, I guess because of the for each loop. There we go. So here are the messages. Now they're kind of squished because this span isn't above, it's still inside the column here at this point in time. So there's the key and there's the actual error message. So again, this is code you would remove before putting it out into production. But now I can look and say, oh, okay, it's all about room capacity. Yeah, that's the actual problem. So that's what we've gained by having that little else structure there, right? So, and let's just finish, of course, figuring out what we have to do here, right? If I just bring up for a second the room class, remember this is what we were asked to do. We're asked to add this integer for capacity, okay? Of course, we know the default value for an integer is 0, right? But we have a range that it must be 1 up to the maximum value of an integer, right? Okay, so how come it's not satisfying this requirement? Well, really, more than anything else, it comes back to how data was seeded here, right? So inside the seed data, here's where we're actually adding all the rooms. So notice that, we're creating our new rooms, room 1, 2, 3, 4. What we really should have here is, of course, an assignment to capacity, right? And, you could use our random number, right? You could use a hard-coded value like 10 or something like that if you wanted to. It'd be better to have a random number, probably between 10 and whatever, right? That would be make sense then. And then when we actually seed the data, we're satisfying that requirement. So that's probably actually the better way to fix it. But I just want to mention another alternative approach that, could work as well is right here, okay? When we're actually defining the properties in the class, in the room class itself, I could also just set a value here, like 10 or something, or 1 even, right? 1 would even satisfy the requirement that it's an integer in this range. It's not 0, right? So that would be another way. That guarantees it'll always actually have a value of 1. Actually, when I think about it more, though, I prefer the approach of doing it in the seed data, because we really should be providing a value for a required integer here in the seed data anyway, right? So that would be my preferred, but this will get us by in a pinch. And, it's hard to argue that, hey, it works. Now, what it means is any new rooms will have a default value of 1, right? But, that's up to the end user, right? That's reasonable to expect that they're actually going to put in the proper capacity value. The main thing, the reason why these annotations are put here is if the user is creating a new room, right? Not something we're seeding in data, but if they're actually creating a room, we want to make sure, right, when they have that up on the create view screen, right, that they actually do provide, first of all, a value because it's required, and a value greater than 0, right? A reasonable integer for the size. And this is doing its job, and that would work, right, even without making any of the changes I'm talking about. But the problem is, of course, we're seeding data in here, and as we seed, we need to actually make sure that we're giving a proper valid value that will pass muster, right, that will pass all the validation checks required, right? So whether you do it here, which is in many ways, I think, my preferred, but this I would accept as well, right, as an approach to guarantee we actually have a value. Now, you might say, well, hey, if I create the room first and pass it to the create view, which sometimes we do to get default values in place, it might confuse the user that, hey, how come it's defaulting to 1? Well, defaults are not that unusual, right? They have the responsibility of setting the capacity of the room to the correct value, and they have the documentation to do that. All right. Anyway, that just finishes that little discussion. No, I'm not going to save anything. But I want to talk about that little tip. So if that's an issue you've been having, okay, this is useful. It usually comes up because most of our errors do appear on the screen. You know what? Maybe I should talk about, I could do it with even with my medical office. One other situation where we might not get the feedback we deserve, the feedback that we would expect. Think about in our views. I can come to any of our create views. It doesn't matter which one. Okay. The doctor create. Oh, no, it has to have a foreign key. What am I saying? It does matter which one. Let's come to the patient, right? In the patient create view, when it was first scaffolded, cast your mind back to remember how this was first written by the tool when it automatically scaffolded the page, right? What we had here, unlike edit, let me bring up both, okay? If we come, say, to the foreign key lookup for doctor, this is how this was scaffolded, right? We have the doctor ID, the select for doctor ID, and we have a validation span, okay, for doctor ID, because there has to be one selected, right? Now we didn't change this at all, right? Because we wouldn't want to have a prompt there, select a doctor. We did that up here for the medical trial because it is nullable, and we need them to be able to select basically a null value for the foreign key. In this case, it made sense to use the caption none, right? There's no medical trial. What medical trial are they in? None, right? But down here for a regular everyday required foreign key, this was perfectly fine. However, focusing on the doctor again over here in the create, okay, this option wasn't there when it was first scaffolded. Neither was this, right? So we came in and we said, no, you know what? Best practice says that a user should not just have a default value to pick out of a drop-down list like this, because they might, without even thinking about it, okay, skip that, not actually select the proper doctor who's being assigned, right? But they don't get a validation error because they haven't gone through the process of making sure they actually do select the proper foreign key value. In this case, select the proper doctor, right? If it just defaults to the first doctor in the list, no validation error, away we go. So that is why we added this option, right? We talked about that in the past. So we're going to add that just to, as a good practice, force the user to make the decision, right? We can't let it just go with whatever the first doctor is in the list. They have to choose a doctor, okay? But the problem was, if you left out this span, right, then you would again be in a position where you're not getting feedback on the screen, right? If I take that out now, if I go and go create a doctor but don't select, well, I'll just come back to the view over and over again, but I'll never see the message show up, right? That's another circumstance where you don't get the feedback you deserve. Okay. Well, anyway, that finishes that discussion. Any questions about that little tip and trick that we talked about a moment ago? All right. Well, let's move on to our actual new content then.